Hi guys. So for this project, I went ahead and conducted additional research on several of the books and topics we covered this semester, such as Victorian true crime, detective fiction, and sensation fiction. And I converted everything I found into a new medium that we have not looked at this semester, poetry. And I created a short poetry collection of 7 poems based on things we covered this semester. But there's a catch. I also researched different popular Victorian poets from the periods different phenomena were popular. And I tried to mirror their poetic voices, their poetic styles, and their basic conventions of poetry. But I also tried to add my own spin to each poem just to make them my own, so I'm not just completely copying um, famous poets. So my main goal was just to defamiliarize what we've learned this semester and showcase detective fiction and its roots in a new light. So the first poem I wrote was about a person featured in the Newgate Calendar. If you don't remember, the Newgate Calendar was a book that was published in Victorian England that just outlined the crimes of people who were in the Newgate prison who were waiting to be hanged. The book has ballads as its general framework, so I kind of just mirrored the ballads that were in the book. Thomas Dunn, who I chose to write about, did not have a ballad in the Newgate Calendar. They just kind of gave a brief description of his crime. So I wrote Thomas Dunn a ballad and just tried to mirror the ballads from the Newgate Calendar, but I made it a little bit different and modernized the language a little bit, and also it was a little longer than the ballads in the Newgate Calendar, but that's okay. So the next poem I wrote was about Constance Kent, because as we learned during the semester, her crime was extremely influential on Victorian literature and sensation fiction and all of that. So I based her poem on one of Lewis Carroll's poems about the dangers of innocence. It's in Alice in Wonderland. I don't remember what the poem is. I didn't have it written down right here, but it's one of the poems in Alice in Wonderland, and basically Lewis Carroll wrote a poem that was defamiliarizing what we know as innocence. And he was kind of showing that there might be some negative connotations with innocence and something to fear of innocence. So I'm going to read to you guys this poem. It's called From Roadhill's Daughter to the Road Killer, William Kent's after breakfast conversation with his sister the morning after his baby brother's murder. Constance, dearest, were you there that night under the sparkling moonlight that shone through the open privy door? Constance, dearest, did you pull out the knife and let the silver blade glide across her baby brother's throat? Constance, dearest, did you catch his head as his infant body bled in a pair of blood-stained hands? Constance, dearest, did you wrap the blanket tight in the middle of the night before you pushed him down the hole head first? Constance, dearest, did you shed a single tear for Elizabeth, our dear, who cared so much for the babies in our home? Constance, dearest, I'll protect you so we will never say adieu, and you can sleep in your cleanest nightdress. So as you can see, the poem has a lot of rhyme. That's because Lewis Carroll wrote his poems like that. The rhyme gives it like a childlike essence, but he wrote about really heavy topics. So it's kind of like, again, defamiliarizing what we know of as innocence. Obviously, Constance was a kid when she murdered her baby brother. So it's kind of like just testing our perceptions of innocence and making us feel a certain type of way. So the next poem I wrote about was about the book Lady Audley's Secret, which was just a sensation novel basically in Victorian England. We kind of talked about it a little bit when we talked about the suspicions of Mr. Witcher. I'm pretty sure the book mentioned it. So for this poem, I used some of Robert Browning's dramatic monologues and just tried to mimic them. So dramatic monologues typically express feelings of longing, and they show the genre alongside the character. So basically, Lady Audley in my poem is lamenting about her life and wishing she was someone else, because in the book, she just keeps making mistakes. That's why she has secrets. She doesn't want to become like her mom, who is apparently mad, but she does end up becoming like her mom. So my poem is her kind of being in denial about all of her mistakes and how they've contributed to her life, but at the same time, you can tell she's feel. I'm so sorry. You can tell she's feeling remorseful. I'm so sorry. Okay. The next poem is about the moonstone, and this one was inspired by William Barnes' poem Tokens. Again, William Barnes is just a famous Victorian poet. I actually hadn't heard about him until I researched this, but he was really well known back then. So he was known for using very color-oriented imagery in his poems, and those different images were meant to evoke feelings of nostalgia and sadness. So I wrote a poem about the moonstone where it's basically from the perspective of the people who are missing the moonstone, the Indians, and just the sadness that they were feeling. And I used different images of the moonstone's color and the color of soil and stuff like that to just evoke that sadness. So the poem's called Where's the Moonstone? And I'm going to read it to you. Yellow, the same hue as sun herself, moon-idled centerpiece, missing, a journey over the brown soils, from many nations, just to see her again, to run fingers along her smooth, polished surface. She belongs to moon, she shines like sun. Does she remember how our voices sing prayer over her resting place on dear moon? Our heartbeats miss beats, our prayers sound raspy in our tired throats, without her yellow hue reflecting light from the sun shining down on our soft soil. A new sun shines on her now, unless she has kept hidden just another piece of treasure in their locked boxes. So yeah, that's that poem. It's pretty short because that's just how William Barnes' poems were. He just had like 2 stanza poems. So the next 2 poems, I grouped them together because they have very similar structures. And I wrote a poem about yellowbacks and I wrote a poem about penny dreadfuls, both of which I think we had historical briefs about. So I wrote them based on Edward Lear poetry. Edward Lear was the person who popularized the limerick, and he wrote limericks to maintain a childlike essence in his poems about serious topics, very similar to why Lewis Carroll wrote the poetry that he did. So I try to do the same thing for the poems about penny dreadfuls and yellowbacks, but I also wanted to use them as commentaries on classism and the threat of academic prestige. Basically, one of them is written from the perspective of a person who reads yellowbacks, and the other one's written from the perspective of somebody who's totally against penny dreadfuls because they see them as subpar literature. I'm not going to read them because they're just super short and not that interesting, but that's what those are. So my last poem was about Sherlock Holmes, and it was the hardest to write because I was trying to live up to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which was impossible. But I wrote it inspired by Alfred Lord Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade, and Tennyson uses that poem to push the boundaries of repetition. And his repetition in that poem, every time he repeats something, it means something different, but he's repeating the same phrase. So it's like changing the meaning of a phrase throughout the poem to defamiliarize it. So that's what I tried to do with this poem about Sherlock Holmes. And the reason I did that was because Holmes was this person who loved solving cases and loved using his insight and great brain power to solve cases, and he thrived on it. But many of the short stories we read kind of showed that when he wasn't solving cases, he was a mess. He was depressed. He was doing drugs. He needed cases to thrive. That was like his only source of happiness. So I kind of wanted to defamiliarize the Holmes that everybody knows and thinks of Holmes as into this person who we discovered Holmes was through our class. And so I did that by using repetition that changes throughout the poem. And I used Watson's name as the repetitive element. So I'm going to read it to you so you can see what I mean. It's called Another Monday for Holmes. Another mystery, it calls to me. Another mystery outside my door. I smell the intrigue from here. Watson, my friend, we must go. Grab your coat and your hat. We must follow the trail at once. The clock is ticking. My brain is racing. Watson, my friend, we must go. Out the door and down the street. My eyes never blink so I don't miss a single clue. Keep your mind open too. Watson, I do have a hunch. A disguised woman here, a bag of stones there. Yes, it is all coming together. Watson, I do have a hunch. Let me share my discoveries with everyone here. Open your ears. I promise it will all make sense. Watson, I've solved the case. It was simple, really. The clues, they were in plain sight. I cannot believe you missed them. But Watson, I've solved the case. We can go home now, I suppose. My mind has finished its work. We can rest after our long day. Watson, help me find my needle. I think I'll need something to do. My mind is bored, and I have a case of post-case blues. Watson, help me find my needle. Again, that was like harder to write because it's Sherlock Holmes. Like, how do you write a poem about Sherlock Holmes that even measures up to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle? You can't. Maybe you can, but I couldn't. It was hard. But yeah, that was my poetry collection and some information about how I created each poem. Yeah, thank you guys so much for listening.